In the early 1800s, medical science was still in its infancy. The study of the human body was being blocked by the strict laws that prohibited the use of cadavers that weren't executed criminals. The 1752 Murder Act stated that any criminal who was hanged would be further punished by having their corpse dissected or gibbeted after death. 79% of criminals would go on to be dissected. After the Murder Act was passed, the number of executed criminals began to drop, which is believed to have happened because of the fear of being dissected after death.
The main part of the population in Scotland, as well as America, was Christian. One of the main beliefs of Christians is that your body should remain intact after death, because if it didn't, then you would not make it to heaven intact. This is a large part of why people were so afraid of dissection.
During the 19th century, the need for cadavers was on the rise. Scientific research was not going any farther, and the scientists at the helm were looking for ways to advance it. This created the opportunity for immoral dealings with people such as the resurrectionists, who would jump at the chance to make a profit.
Two men who had no qualms doing this were William Burke and William Hare. Hare emigrated from Ireland to Scotland and went through many different occupations before he became the owner of a lodging house, the setting of many of these horrendous crimes. Burke was also from Ireland, and when he met Hare, they became fast friends. Burke also helped at the lodging house, which is where our story begins.
Burke and Hare were renting out the lodging house to an elderly man when tragedy struck. The man passed away not at the fault of Burke and Hare. The man had not paid his rent yet, and they were in desperate need of money. To gain this money, they sold his body to Dr. Robert Knox, a lecturer on anatomy in Britain, as well as the creator of the theory of transcendental anatomy. In return for the cadaver, Knox paid them between 8 to 10 pounds. This tragic event began what would later be known as the infamous Burke and Hare murders. In all, Burke and Hare murdered 16 people. However, some were more well documented than others, and they are the murders that we describe here.
Spurred on by the incentive of money, they began to kill in earnest. Burke declared, "We will make it our business to look out for persons to decoy into our house to murder them." The first victim was Abigail Simpson. She was murdered in February of 1828. She was an elderly woman whom the pair invited to stay at the lodging house. They offered her whiskey and got her intoxicated enough to pass out. However, they too drank the whiskey in excess and got too drunk to finish the job. In the morning, they offered her more whiskey to cure her hangover, getting her drunk once more. They then smothered her to death and brought her body to Dr. Knox, who offered them 10 pounds.
Mary Patterson and Janet Brown were 18-year-old prostitutes who were invited to breakfast at Burke's brother's house on April 9, 1828. Just as they had with Abigail Simpson, they offered them whiskey, enough for Mary Patterson to pass out. Janet Brown, on the other hand, was holding her liquor well. Burke then took Brown out to the tavern and to attempt to get her drunk there. Still, she was not drunk, so Burke took her to the lodging house to continue the attempt there. However, Burke's mistress, Helen McDougall, was waiting there, and when she saw that Burke had brought home a prostitute, she became very angry. They began to argue, with Burke finally driving Helen out, but she began to scream from outside. Brown then became very uncomfortable and left, escaping with her life intact.
In June of 1828, Burke crossed paths with an elderly woman and her deaf grandson, who were asking for directions. Burke said that he would show them the way, but would make a stop at his lodge for rest. When they arrived, the elderly woman drank the whiskey she was offered and followed suit to her death, while her grandson was entertained in another room by Helen and Margaret, who was Hare's wife. They argued whether or not to let the boy go, as he would probably not drink the whiskey. It was also argued that he would return with authorities. In the end, they decided to kill him, but not in the usual way of whiskey and suffocation. Instead, they broke his back. Together, they sold for 16 pounds.
James Wilson was one of the last victims, who was crippled with a bad foot. Wilson was well known around town, so Hare decided to target him. Wilson asked if Hare had seen his mother. Hare responded by telling him that he did know where she was and that he should follow him. Burke soon joined them, and they attempted to ply him with the whiskey, but neither could get him to drink much. They tried to smother him anyway, but he put up a fight, even pinning down Burke at one point. They eventually killed him and sold his body. Soon after, his mother came looking for him, and many of Knox's students had recognized Jamie. So, to prevent the authorities from becoming aware, they cut off his head and his bad foot.
The final victim of Burke and Hare's tragic act was Mary Docherty. She was not murdered immediately because of another couple at the lodging house who went by the name Gray. Burke convinced the Grays to stay at another lodging house. The next day, Jane Gray came to retrieve her stockings, which were left on the bed. However, she was refused. The Grays managed to get into the house but found the body of Mary Docherty under the bed. Understandably alarmed, they called the police. Helen attempted to bribe them with £10 a week, but it was already too late. Burke and Hare did manage to remove the body from the house before the authorities could arrive, but many witnesses saw them carrying a large tea chest from the house. The police had little evidence, but when they interrogated Burke and Helen, they found that the stories did not match. They soon found Docherty's body in Knox's classroom.
These were very horrific crimes, and inspired such fear into the people of Edinburgh that there was even a term coined for this type of body snatching. It was called burking, and at the time many people were afraid of becoming the victim of the famed Burke and Hare.
This tragedy was one of the events that helped pass the Anatomy Act of 1832. The act was originally designed to stop people, such as the resurrectionists, who would dig up the bodies of those recently deceased. The resurrectionists were not only active in Europe, they also created problems in America. In 1788, an event called the Doctors' Riot occurred in New York City, all because of the actions of a few people at the Columbia College. Some students were accused of stealing corpses from the Potter's Field, and a site now known as the African Burial Ground. This came to a head when in February of 1788, the body of a white woman vanished.
It is not clear what exactly started the riot, but it is widely believed that either children playing in a field near the college saw a doctor with part of a cadaver, or a distraught widower found his late wife's corpse gone and gathered some men to storm the college. Either way, it ended in a group of about 5,000 people storming the college and homes of doctors who worked there. It ended in 20 people dead.
Between the actions of Burke and Hare and the events of the Doctors' Riot, it became clear that something needed to be done to prevent this from happening in the future. As a result, the Anatomy Act of 1832 was brought up and later passed. They initially tried to pass it in 1828, but it was voted down by Parliament. After the result of Burke's trial, it was passed through.
The Anatomy Act ended the use of cadavers of executed murderers and allowed scientists to use the bodies of those who had passed away in prisons or workhouses and were unclaimed. This allowed scientists to further research the human body without such illegal suppliers.
Eventually, even without the Anatomy Act, we would have discovered all that we know now, perhaps in a while down the line. However, this does not excuse the ethical boundaries that were crossed in the pursuit of science.
In the years following the passing of the Anatomy Act, there were many breakthroughs in medical tools and techniques. Doctors began using antiseptic as well as new painkillers, such as aspirin. Leukemia was studied more thoroughly and correctly described as a blood disorder. Many different men were able to successfully perform surgeries on the heart and pericardium, in part due to the Anatomy Act of 1832.
The Burke and Hare murders were a horrific tragedy, one that struck fear in the hearts of the people of Edinburgh. The blatant ignorance of moral ethics was one component that was involved in this tragedy. Through the darkness arose the triumphant Anatomy Act, which was successful in making the use of cadavers more ethical. As a result of this, it is evident that you can find triumph even in the face of tragedy.